What I want to talk about in this short film is the subject of prosody. A particular version of prosody, which is the prosody of statement and story in poems, which have a dynamic relationship and are one of the most important structural elements, structural architectures, you could say, of contemporary and modern poetry. The prosody of statement and story. Usually when people talk about prosody, traditionally, conventionally, it means metrics, rhythms, the sonic elements of poems, rhyme, stresses. That's usually what we mean when we talk about formal poetry and we talk about prosodic analysis, and we say this line is written in iambic pentameter, with one variation. So that's usually the way that people use the word prosody. But in fact, there are lots of different kinds of prosody. And it's important to acknowledge that in American poetry and in English poetry, what the prosodic laws that govern poetry were changed profoundly and fundamentally and probably permanently in the 20th century, either by modernism in the early 20th century or in the mid-century. In other words, we let go of rhyme and meter. And when we let go of rhyme and meter, and we did that for various kinds of reasons, we let go of the structural principles that governed the makings of poems for a very long time, for centuries and centuries. Most of the great poetry was governed by the prosody of rhyme and meter. So when you let go of one kind of structure, sort of like the skeletal structure of an animal, you need another structure to put into its place in order to organize the poem, in order to represent its proportions and represent the theater of beginning, middle, and end, and the shapeliness of poems. And one of the prosodies that one might say that we replaced rhyme and meter with was the prosody of the dynamic relationship between statements and story, or between material details and abstract ideas, or between generalizations and particular details. The relationship between particulars and abstract assertions is an essential structural element of contemporary and modern poetry, and really all poetry that I can think of. A lot of people would say that the prosodic replacement for rhyme and meter was lineation, contemporary lineation, line breaks, and the way that the sentence breaks across lines, and that's profoundly true. It's the first thing you should understand. But to think about the relationship between statement and story is, I think, a useful thing to consider a kind of prosody. So we're going to look at a couple of examples of that, of course, that in modest short poems, I want to show you the relationship between the the power of this statement buried or placed somewhere in a poem, which is a fund of details, a story, a narrative, or just a bunch of descriptive details. And the relationship between them is sort of the relationship between, it's sort of a pyramid. It's a relationship between an idea and a big generalization, or being down in the particulars of experience. So I'm going to read this short poem, not a great poem, by a poet I like a lot, Linda Gregg, an American poet. And the poem is called Fragments. And as I read it, and as you look at it on the screen, you'll be able to identify when the statement comes. Fragments. You can't call the exhausted people on the 1 or 9 line beautiful, especially the drunk in the back, yelling and stumbling and grabbing the pole gracefully just in time. Beauty has a strangeness. The old man leaning against the cement column at the station on 42nd when I changed to the N or the R has 3 holes in his pants. Neon and magazine covers about a new couple. I believe everyone is going home. This is the way. Now, you see that this is a scene, I should have said this before reading the poem, it's a scene sort of set at night on the subway, probably in New York, and it's about the sort of garish poverty and strangeness of being in an urban democratic environment at an odd hour of the night. But you'll see that in the middle of the poem, there's a statement, and the statement really changes everything about this fairly ugly urban landscape. And that statement is, beauty has a strangeness. Beauty has a strangeness. Now, when we read a poem and we encounter such a moment, we notice it. We notice that we're getting kind of like the center pole that holds up a tent. You know, we're getting the axis that holds the wheels together, that is sort of the drive shaft of the poem. Beauty has a strangeness. And when we notice it, we immediately begin to contemplate and to compare and to try to fit together, in a way you could say, the housing of the abstraction and the abstraction itself. Beauty has a strangeness. And so we look at the details of the drunk stumbling and grabbing the pole, and the guy with 3 holes in his pants, and the magazine covers on the kiosk, on the magazine kiosk, showing a new celebrity couple. And we think, is this strange and is this beautiful? As the writer, as the speaker of the poem has claimed, beauty has a strangeness. And in the case of this particular poem, I find it a plausible statement. And so in a certain kind of way, that statement itself becomes the context for the whole poem. You could say that the abstract statements in a poem are a kind of umbrella of generalization that contextualizes the details. And at the same time, the reverse is also true. The details are the context for the statement. One or the other by themselves is much less than they are together. When we encounter that statement, beauty has a strangeness, we are called upon to collate the idea with the scene, with the little landscape that we've been given. And we're called upon to interrogate those details in terms of that abstraction. Beauty has a strangeness. And I think, well, this is a strange landscape. It's ugly and humble too, but it is strange, and late at night is strange in the city. And then she's also asserting that it's beautiful. And I think, well, that's an interesting assertion. I certainly wouldn't have thought that this was beautiful, but I want to entertain that idea. And so the dynamic way in which the abstraction and the details are fitting together creates a kind of energy field or a kind of radiance between them in which they are interpreting and contextualizing each other. The abstract statement here in this example is imposing the idea of beauty on an ugly, humble landscape. As I say, this is a very typically American poetry thing to do, to say that the humble can be elevated, and to say that the ugly is actually beautiful. It's a modernist concept too. Pretty typical American sort of innovation, you could say, that starts with William Carlos Williams and his Red Wheelbarrow. But here Linda Gregg is doing it. Beauty has a strangeness. But that idea, if it came first, just consider if it came right up at top of the poem, or if it were just by itself and somebody said beauty has a strangeness, we would say, I guess you might be right, but it wouldn't mean anything to us because we hadn't been given a context of details in which to consider these sorts of things. So how about the drunk in the back yelling and stumbling and grabbing the pole, the subway pole, gracefully just in time. So suddenly the drunk is sort of like a ballet dancer. And again, that supports and in a certain kind of way verifies the abstraction. So the relationship between the abstractions and the stories of a poem are powerful and radiant and larger than either one of them. So this is your first example. We consider too that where a particular abstraction is planted in the poem, there are famous examples. There's James Wright's poem called "Lying in a Hammock on William Duffy's Farm," and the last line in the poem is "I have wasted my life." So in that case, he puts the statement at the end of the poem. A counterexample is W.H. Auden's poem "Musée de Beaux-Arts," something you all read in high school, and the first sentence of that is about suffering. They were never wrong, the old masters, how well they understood its human position. And so the statement there is sort of the header of the poem. And as we read through the details of the poem, we find that that statement is indeed verified and supported by the details and the images of the poem. So the statement is part of the architecture, and where a poet places the statement, sort of embeds the statement in the poem, is a very important kind of structural element. There are better and worse places probably to put your statement. If it's right at the beginning of a poem, you could be accused of writing an essay with the thesis statement up top. Another thing to consider is if that statement, if that abstract statement is not verified by the materials in the poem, then we're just left scratching our heads and we're unconvinced. And I want to give you an example of that now by looking at another poem by Linda Gregg called "Beauty." And I'll read it now, and you can read it on your screen. Wait for the statement. Once again, in this poem, the abstract statement is embedded or buried in the middle of the poem. But when we encounter it, we have no doubt that we're encountering something that's sort of seminal and elemental, that we're meant to notice and that we're meant to use to interpret and unify the contents of the poem. Beauty. There she was on Entertainment Tonight. Someone had caught a glimpse of Bardot after all those years. Brigitte Bardot, if you don't know, is a movie star of yesteryear. Brigitte Bardot running through the trees across a meadow, a dog running with her, the hair still long. Then another part showing her on the patio, aged, sun-damaged, we say. The violation of beauty never happens just once. When my father heard his beloved dog had chased and killed the rancher's sheep, he went right out and shot it. Because, he said, once they ran with the pack and tasted blood, it would never stop. So this poem is structured differently. But we do notice that statement right in the middle of the poem, the violation of beauty never happens just once. And what we have in this poem, as opposed to the unified scene of the poem Fragments by Linda Gregg, what we have in this one is two stories. The first story about Brigitte Bardot being on Entertainment Tonight, a TV show, and Brigitte Bardot sort of being discovered and photographed by paparazzi. And then we have the statement, the violation of beauty never happens just once, which is an interesting statement in which we immediately try to use to contextualize the story of Brigitte Bardot. Brigitte Bardot, movie star, the violation of beauty never happens just once. I can put that together. Yes, if you were beautiful, then one day you are no longer beautiful. That's a violation. And then also, suddenly you're on national TV. That's another kind of violation. So I can put the abstraction together with the first half of the poem. And the second half of the poem is quite a leap to an entirely different story. When my father heard his beloved dog had chased and killed the rancher's sheep, he went right out and shot it because, he said, once they ran with the pack and tasted blood, it would never stop. So I'm scratching my head and I'm saying, what does this have to do with the violation of beauty? Well, it's true that the dog, allegedly, if the dog gets the taste for for blood and attacking animals, it will probably do it again. So does that mean that the sheep are the correlative for beauty in the poem, and that the sheep are like Brigitte Bardot, and that the dog is like the paparazzi who take photographs of Brigitte Bardot, and that, or that when Brigitte Bardot loses her beauty, that it's like a dog attacking innocent animals? Well, in this case, the abstraction and the second of the two stories, they seem to wiggle around in relationship to each other. And although I could use my ingenuity and school learning, to make sense of the poem and to argue that the poem makes sense, I actually find that these parts do not go together. And there are three parts: story number one, abstraction, and story number two. But they don't really collate. They don't compute. And so I would say that this is an example of a poem that has an authoritative structure that we want to believe, and an authoritative and indeed quite interesting assertion. These are quite important elements when you're using statements. Is it be interesting, it not be something totally obvious and true and cliched, saying something like, love is the most important thing in the world. That's a bad poem, Tiffany. I'm sorry, C-. We don't want to use cliches. We want to use an interesting abstraction, like the violation of beauty never happens just once. And yet, the parts of this poem do not go together in the way that a really successful resonance gets set up between the parts of a successful poem. So there you have some of the laws and some of the rules that sort of govern the prosody of how statement and story go together. And I'm going to show you maybe one or two more poems quite quickly and talk through them quite quickly. I spoke about where the statement is positioned in the poem, and that's quite an interesting issue, because in a certain kind of way, these overarching statements, well, in a way they represent the intellect, which looks down on the world of experience and makes sense of it, generalizes about it. We want to understand the world, and we also want to hold the world at a distance. So abstraction itself kind of has a paradoxical function. But the placement of the statement in the poem is quite important. So I'm going to read you again one more poem by Linda Gray. This is quite a good poem, I think. And you'll see, I'll leave it up to you to discern where the abstraction is. And this poem is called Growing Up. It's only about 6 lines long. Growing Up. I am reading Li Po. Li Po is an ancient Chinese poet. I am reading Li Po. The TV is on with the sound off. I've seen this movie before. I turn on the sound just for a moment when the man says, I love you. Then turn it off and go on reading. Okay? I'll read it again. Growing Up. I am reading Li Po. The TV is on with the sound off. I turn on the sound just for a moment when the man says, I love you. Then turn it off and go on reading. It's a wonderfully mysterious poem. Where is the abstraction? Well, the abstraction is actually in the title. And you can see the way in which that title, Growing Up, is a kind of umbrella idea which covers all the details in the poem. So we know that this little vignette of the speaker watching TV with the sound off while reading a book and knowing the movie and turning on the sound just for a second when one of the male actors says, I love you, and then turning it off and going on reading, we know that in some ways this little vignette represents growing up, the achievement of adulthood, And so what that means, the way we put those pieces together, it has a certain amount of ambiguity. It has a certain amount of uncertainty about it. There are different kinds of inferences and implications and suggestivenesses in how those two parts go together. And yet, even though there is a certain amount of play, there's not an absolute certainty about what the speaker means. I'm completely convinced that the vignette represents a state of maturity, which which the title tells me and which I am convinced of. So again, once again, in this instance, the details provide a context for the abstraction, and the abstraction enriches and greatly deepens the details. You can see how it deepens the details. Without that title growing up, the poem is still a sort of marvelous little vignette, rather stoical and under-emoted. But with that title, it becomes deep and rich and resonant. And the same thing is true that without the details of the vignette, the poem, the title growing up would mean nothing. They enrich each other, and in a certain way, a kind of echo chamber is set up between them. So you go back and forth between the abstraction and the story, the abstraction and the story, the abstraction story, and you keep seeing new dimensions of it. Why does she want to hear the man say, "I love you"? Is it because she's been through many romances and she's tired of it, and yet she's still just a little bit fond, of the words, "I love you"? Is she lonely? Is she full of acceptance and wisdom and resignation? Or is she just really content and she doesn't really need to watch that fairy tale movie anymore, which is why the sound is off? There's all kinds of possibilities. You go back and forth between the abstraction and the story, and they continue to enrich each other. This is what a good poem does, is over a long period of time, it will sustain reading and rereading, and its resonance is embodied inside it in a way that can never quite be resolved, and yet has a lot of precision and a lot of experience, a lot of digested experience behind it. So when you're reading poems, if you are a student of poetry, you really want to do what I've done, which is sort of identify the way that these different types of elements are in a dynamic interplay, and study the way that the poet has structured and architectured her poem, and sort of learn from their successes and to experiment with them. I mentioned earlier, having a good statement is a pretty nice thing to have. And so just consider, what is an interesting statement? Well, last week I read a poem, and one of the sentences in the poem was, "Sometimes it's okay to lie." And I think, I like that. Sometimes it's okay to lie. That's an interesting statement. You put that into a poem, and all of a sudden the details in the poem begin to circulate and orbit around that statement. And we have to try and integrate them. Sometimes it's okay to lie. Or how about the statement, "Emotion is governed by strict laws"? That's an interesting statement. And it could be attached creatively to any of many different kinds of stories. Emotion is governed by strict laws. So being able to be conceptually creative and conceptually inventive is as important as being able to be inventive in the sort of material details and the stories and the particularities of your poem too. So those are some of the dynamics and some of the ways in which the prosody of statement and story work together in poems. Most poems, in fact. That's all.